Something is missing from the history books, not a footnote, not a detail. Something enormous, the kind of thing that once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and you begin to wonder why you were never shown it in the first place. Before 1850, scattered across every continent, there existed machines and structures that defied what we were taught about the limits of pre-industrial technology. They were not primitive, they were not accidental, they were sophisticated, deliberate, and in many cases still standing. Repurposed, renamed, stripped of their original function, folded into a sanitized explanation that raises more questions than it answers. The people who built them operated on principles that modern engineers are only now beginning to rediscover. And then, in a span of devastating decades, those people and their knowledge disappeared. This is not a video about fringe theory. Every device in this list is documented. Every structure is photographed. Every mechanism either still exists in a museum, in the ground, or in the walls of a building you might walk past every single day without recognizing what it once was. The question is not whether these things existed. The question is why no one taught you about them, and whose interests were served by making sure you never thought to ask. What happened before 1850 is a story that was aggressively rewritten. The civilization that built these devices was vast, interconnected, and technologically advanced in ways that contradict the official timeline. That civilization had a name. Some researchers call it Tartaria. And whether or not you accept that name, what you cannot deny are the devices themselves, 10 of them, each one running without combustion, without fuel, without any of the energy sources the history books claim were the only options available before the Industrial Revolution. Each one, in its own way, later erased, suppressed, or quietly reclassified into irrelevance. These are those 10 devices. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history they don't put in school textbooks, you already know what to do. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. This channel covers the history that got buried, the technology that got erased, and the questions that never got answered. You do not want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's go back. Device 1. The Tartarian Resonance Towers. Look at any photograph of a 19th century city, not a modern skyline, but the real thing. The world before the reset. What do you notice? Spires, towers, ornate vertical structures rising from rooftops, from cathedrals, from government buildings, from train stations and hospitals and universities. Dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, in a single city block. Today we call them decorative. We say they were built for aesthetics, for religious symbolism, for civic prestige. But that explanation has a problem. Decoration costs money, enormous amounts of it. Many of these structures were built in cities that were, by all other accounts, struggling to fund basic sanitation and road infrastructure. So why spend staggering resources on spires that served no function? They served a function, just not one the textbooks acknowledge. The Tartarian civilization, the advanced global culture that, according to suppressed historical evidence, predated the 19th century reset, operated on principles of resonant energy. The towers were receivers. They drew energy from the Earth's natural electromagnetic field, from the interaction between the ionosphere and the crust, from the resonant frequencies that pulse through the planet in measurable, predictable waves. Nikola Tesla understood this. That is precisely what he was reconstructing with Wardenclyffe Tower in 1901. He was not inventing something new. He was remembering something old. The geometry of these spires is not random. The proportions, the material choices, copper finials, iron subframes, specific stone compositions are consistent across structures built on separate continents by cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. Gothic cathedrals in France, Buddhist stupas in Southeast Asia, the towers of Russian Orthodox churches, the minarets of Central Asian mosques. Same proportions, same materials, same upward tapering geometry terminating in a metallic point. A structural analysis of several pre-1850 towers in Central Europe identified copper content in spire frameworks with no load-bearing justification. Copper does not add strength to a stone tower, but copper is an excellent electrical conductor. And these towers were positioned almost universally above intersections of underground water channels, locations where natural telluric electromagnetic activity is measurably elevated even today. They were not built to reach God. They were built to pull energy from the earth and sky simultaneously. And when the civilization that knew how to use them was erased, the towers became monuments to a technology no one was permitted to remember. Device 2. The Baghdad Battery. In 1938, a German archaeologist named Wilhelm König was sorting through basement storage at the National Museum of Iraq when he found a clay jar roughly the size of a large fist. Inside was a copper cylinder. Inside the copper cylinder was an iron rod. The entire assembly was sealed at the top with asphalt. König recognized it immediately. An electrochemical cell. A battery. The jar dated to approximately 250 BCE. It was not unique. Subsequent excavations across the Tigris-Euphrates region found dozens of similar assemblies across a wide geographic area and a time span of several centuries. When modern replicas were built using the same materials and filled with an acidic solution, grape juice, vinegar, citric acid, they produced between 1.5 and 2 volts of electricity, consistently, reliably, for hours. The official explanation, where one exists, is electroplating, coating base metals with silver or gold using electrical current, and there is supporting evidence. Gold-plated artifacts from the same period have been found with plating so thin and so uniform that modern electrochemists confirm it could not have been achieved through fire gilding alone. Someone was running sustained current through a liquid medium and depositing metal ion by ion. Someone understood polarity. Someone understood the process well enough to control it, repeat it, and scale it. That is not an accidental discovery. That is a body of knowledge. And if that knowledge existed in the ancient Middle East more than 2,000 years before the official history of electricity begins, the question is not just how it got there, it's where it went. The Baghdad battery produced electricity without combustion, no fire, no steam, no refined fuel, a clay vessel, 2 metals, and an acidic liquid available to anyone near a vineyard. And for reasons archaeology has never satisfactorily resolved, this technology did not develop further. It did not spread. It appeared. It functioned for centuries. Then it vanished completely, leaving only jars in a museum basement for a 20th century archaeologist to find almost by accident. Device 3. Hero's Aeolipile. In the 1st century of the Common Era, in the great city of Alexandria, a mathematician and engineer named Hero described a device that should not have existed for another 17 centuries. He called it the Aeolipile, the wind ball. It was a sealed metal sphere mounted on hollow axles connected to a boiling water chamber below. As steam rose through the axles into the sphere, it escaped through 2 curved nozzles on opposite sides. The escaping steam created thrust. The sphere rotated continuously, powered entirely by the conversion of heat energy into rotational mechanical force. That is a steam turbine, not a rough approximation. Not a precursor? A functional steam turbine, the same operating principle as the machines that powered the Industrial Revolution. Built and documented in ancient Alexandria, 18 centuries before James Watt filed his first patent. Hero did not hide his work. He published it. He described the Aeolipile alongside dozens of other mechanical and pneumatic devices in a text called the Pneumatica, which survived through the medieval period into the Renaissance. European engineers had access to Hero's descriptions, and yet nothing. No steam-powered development for 1700 years. A working principle, published and available, simply never pursued. The question is why. One explanation is that ancient slave economies had no economic incentive to replace human labor with machines. But Hero himself described automated theatrical mechanisms, coin-operated dispensers, and programmable mechanical carts. He was clearly interested in automation for its own sake, as were his patrons. Economic disincentive alone does not explain 17 centuries of dormancy for a technology already invented and demonstrated. The Tartaria framework offers a different reading. The Eolipile was not a curiosity that was never developed. It was a surviving fragment of a much older engineering tradition, one already operating steam-driven and pneumatic systems at scale, whose broader knowledge base was methodically erased. What we call Hero's invention may have been Hero's rediscovery, and what looks like a gap in development may have been a deliberate clearing of the record. Device 4. The Antikythera mechanism. In 1900, sponge divers near the Greek island of Antikythera found the wreck of an ancient Roman-era cargo ship. Among the recovered artifacts was a corroded lump of bronze that no one could identify. It sat in a museum in Athens for decades, slowly fragmenting before researchers began to understand what they were looking at. What they were looking at was a mechanical computer, a hand-cranked bronze device containing at least 37 precision-cut gears organized into a system of differential drives, epicyclic gearing, and pin-and-slot mechanisms, technologies that Western history does not officially rediscover until the 13th and 14th centuries. The device tracked the sun and moon, predicted eclipses using the Saros and Metonic cycles, tracked the 4-year Olympiad calendar, and modelled the elliptical orbit of the moon with sufficient precision to account for the moon's variable speed. A mathematical refinement Copernicus would not formalize until 1543. The Antikythera mechanism was built around 100 BCE. It ran on no fuel. It required no power source beyond a human hand turning a crank. It computed, accurately, repeatedly, reliably, astronomical data that would take a trained mathematician hours to calculate by hand. And it was not a prototype. The finishing quality, the sophistication of the gearing ratios, the elegance of the mechanical solutions to genuinely complex mathematical problems, all of it indicates a device that was the product of a mature engineering tradition, not one individual inventing something new. That tradition left no other direct artifacts, no earlier versions, no workshop records, no competing designs. The Antikythera mechanism appears in the historical record, fully formed, singular, and impossible under the assumptions of the standard timeline, a 2,000-year-old computer with no predecessors and, more tellingly, no successors. The knowledge to build it existed once. Then it was simply gone. Device 5. The Dendera electric reliefs. In the temple of Hathor at Dendera, Egypt, carved into stone walls more than 2,000 years old, there are images that Egyptologists call ritual depictions of lotus flowers and serpents. Look at them through a different lens, which several electrical engineers have, and you see something else entirely. The carvings show what appears to be a large glass bulb, elongated and tapered, with a filament-like serpentine form inside. A cable or conduit connects the base of each bulb to a device consistent in shape with a Crookes tube, an evacuated glass vessel through which high-voltage current can be passed to produce visible glow discharge. A pillar at the base has been interpreted by analysts as resembling a high-voltage insulator of the type used in early electrical experimentation. In the 1980s, Austrian electrical engineer Walter Gahn built a physical replica of the Dendera relief using the proportions from the carved image. When connected to an induction coil producing high-frequency current, it glowed. The serpent-shaped electrode inside the evacuated glass produced visible plasma discharge consistent with what is depicted in stone. The replica worked. This does not prove ancient Egyptians had electric lighting in the modern sense. What it does prove is that the geometry carved in that temple is consistent with a functional electrical discharge device, and that the consistency is not accidental. The relief is not the only evidence. Chemical analysis of paint residue inside certain sealed Egyptian tombs has found no soot on the ceilings, no evidence of torch smoke in spaces that would have required sustained light sources to paint the extraordinarily detailed murals covering their walls. Something was lighting those rooms, something that did not burn. In the Tartaria framework, Egypt was not a primitive civilization using torches and fire alone. It was an outpost of a global advanced culture with access to technologies including electrical illumination. The dendera reliefs in this reading are not religious mythology. They are technical documentation, carved in stone precisely because stone lasts, preserved for whoever came after with the eyes to read it. Device 6. The Atmospheric Railway. In 1847, the South Devon Railway in England began operating a stretch of rail line with no locomotive, no steam engine pulling carriages, and no horses. The carriages moved anyway. And they moved faster than any steam train of the time. The system ran on air. A cast iron pipe 15 inches in diameter ran between the rails for the entire length of the line. Inside was a piston connected to the lead carriage by an arm passing through a longitudinal slot sealed with a leather flap valve. At stations, powerful stationary pumping engines, fixed on the ground, evacuated air from the pipe ahead of the piston. Atmospheric pressure behind the piston drove the carriage forward. The carriages ran silently, cleanly, and at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour on steeper gradients, unmatched by any contemporary steam locomotive. The engineer was Isambard Kingdom Bruno, but he was not the first. George Medhurst had patented a working pneumatic transport concept in 1812, 35 years before Brunel's implementation. The Dublin and Kingstown Railway's atmospheric extension opened a year before South Devon, and in Paris the Saint-Germain atmospheric system was already carrying passengers through underground tunnels using identical principles. The atmospheric railway required no onboard fuel, no locomotive weight, no spark risk in tunnels, no ash or cinder burns on passengers, no coal smoke fouling the air. It was quiet, fast and clean. And it worked. The standard explanation for its disappearance is rats. Leather valve seals allegedly gnawed apart along the South Devon line, causing air leaks that made the system impractical. But this explanation has been contested by railway historians for generations, and the simultaneous abandonment of multiple atmospheric projects across multiple countries within a single decade suggests something more deliberate than a pest control problem. Someone decided the world would run on coal. The atmospheric railway was inconvenient to that decision. Device 7. The Roman Hippocaust. Walk into the ruins of a Roman bath complex anywhere from Britain to the Middle East and examine the floor structure. You will find a forest of small brick pillars, pili, standing about 2 feet high, supporting a raised stone floor over an empty subfloor space. Behind one wall is a furnace opening. This is the Hippocaust, the Roman underfloor heating system, operational across the empire for several centuries, representing an engineering achievement most of medieval Europe would not replicate for 1,000 years after Rome's collapse. The furnace heated air. The heated air flowed naturally through the subfloor space via convection, warming the stone floor evenly across its entire surface. Hollow tiles, tubuli, built into the walls allowed warm air to circulate upward through the wall structure, providing radiant heat from multiple surfaces simultaneously. The result was a room maintaining consistent thermal comfort without direct exposure to fire, without smoke filling interior spaces, and with dramatically higher energy efficiency than any open hearth system. But the Hippocaust becomes particularly interesting where no furnace connection has been identified. There are Roman-era structures in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean where the subfloor heating architecture is intact and unmistakable, but the heat source is architecturally inconsistent with a wood-burning furnace, or absent entirely. At a number of these sites, geothermal positioning has been documented. The structures sit directly above natural hot spring systems, with the Hippocaust serving to distribute naturally occurring ground heat rather than combusted fuel. The Romans knew what was beneath them. They chose those sites deliberately. They engineered a distribution system for a free, pre-existing heat source and integrated it into architecture that appeared, to any outside observer, identical to a fuel-dependent heating system. That knowledge, how to locate, access and distribute geothermal energy through built environments, does not appear in any surviving Roman technical text. it is observed in the archaeological record, and then it ends. Device 8. The Vimana craft. The Vedic texts of ancient India contain detailed technical descriptions of flying vehicles called Vimanas. This is not metaphor. The Vaimanika Shastra, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the Samarangana Sutradhara, Mela, multiple independent ancient Sanskrit texts written across different centuries describe Vimanas with a specificity and internal consistency that goes far beyond allegory. They describe craft that flew, they describe construction materials, they describe the principles by which those craft were powered. The Samarangana Sutradhara dedicates an entire chapter to Vimana construction, describing strong, durable bodies built from lightweight materials, mechanisms concealed within the structure, and a power source based on something translated variously as mercury vortex, quicksilver centrifuge, or rotating liquid metal. A spinning column of mercury, brought to operating temperature, generated upward thrust. The text describes the sounds these craft made, their behavior at altitude, their maneuverability, and techniques required to pilot them safely. In the 1990s, scientists at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore examined the Vaimanika Shastra's descriptions and concluded that several of the described craft designs were aerodynamically valid, consistent with craft that could generate lift under the right conditions. The mercury vortex engine described in the Samarangana Sutradhara has been examined by aerospace researchers, who note that rotating plasma and high-temperature liquid metal produce electromagnetic fields with directional force properties, consistent with what the ancient text describes. The Tartarian interpretation does not place Vimana technology in ancient India in isolation. It connects it to a shared global technological heritage. The descriptions in Sanskrit texts, the reliefs in Egyptian temples, the impossible towers of 19th century cities, these are not separate mysteries. They are fragments of the same erased record surfacing in whatever cultural substrate managed to preserve them in the centuries after the reset. Vimanas did not run on combustion. They ran on principles the current scientific establishment has barely begun to formalize, and someone once knew exactly how to build them. Device 9. Greek fire. In 672 CE, the Byzantine Empire deployed a weapon that its enemies described with terror and bewilderment in accounts that survive to this day. They called it liquid fire, sea fire, Roman fire. We call it Greek fire. It was a projected incendiary, PEEM, launched from ships through bronze tubes thrown in clay grenades poured from towers onto attackers below, that burned on water, that reignited when doused, that clung to surfaces and continued burning until the fuel was entirely consumed or physically scraped away. Water did not extinguish it. Sand or urine were the only partially effective countermeasures. Greek fire ended sieges. It destroyed fleets. It was the decisive weapon in multiple major Byzantine military victories across 2 centuries. Its existence represented such a decisive advantage that the Byzantines classified it at the highest level of state secrecy. The formula was known only to the emperor and the family of Callinicus of Heliopolis, Marnure, the Syrian engineer credited with its introduction, and passed from emperor to emperor as a state inheritance. Then it was lost. Not gradually, not through obsolescence, completely and abruptly sometime in the 13th century with the disruptions of the Crusader period and the weakening of Byzantine central authority. Every proposed formula since, naphtha-based, quicklime-based, phosphorus-based, has failed to fully replicate the documented properties. The ability to reignite after water contact, the ability to float and burn, the adhesive clinging behavior. Modern chemists working with materials available to a 7th century Syrian engineer cannot reproduce these properties simultaneously, which raises the question of whether Callinicus was working from knowledge that predated the 7th century by a significant margin, inherited from a source the official record does not acknowledge. The formula was not invented, it was remembered, and when the chain of memory was broken, it was gone completely because no one knew anymore where it had actually come from. Device 10. The The singing statues of Memnon, at the edge of the Theban necropolis on the west bank of the Nile. Two massive stone figures have faced east for more than 3,000 years. They are the Colossi of Memnon, each carved from a single block of quartzite sandstone, standing over 18 meters tall, weighing approximately 720 tons. For centuries in the ancient world, they were famous not for their size, but for their voice. Every morning at sunrise, the northern colossus sang. Greek and Roman visitors recorded it in inscriptions carved directly into the statue's legs. More than 90 surviving inscriptions describing the sound as a musical note, a ringing tone, a voice that emerged from the stone at the precise moment that direct sunlight first struck the figure. The sound was heard by emperors, poets, and generals. Strabo the geographer heard it and described it in writing. Pausanias heard it. The Roman Emperor Hadrian camped nearby for 2 days specifically to hear it, and had his court poet compose an ode to the experience. The modern standard explanation is thermal expansion. Cracked stone damaged in a 27 BCE earthquake absorbing solar heat and expanding with sufficient force to produce a tone in the fracture. This is physically plausible. It also fails to explain why the sound was consistently described as musical, a single clean note rather than a random structural creak, and why it ceased entirely after the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus ordered the statue restored and the crack repaired around 199 CE. After the repair, the statue was silent. It has never sung again. The Tartaria interpretation treats the Colossi of Memnon as deliberate acoustic technology, an engineered resonance device built to respond to the specific electromagnetic and thermal conditions of sunrise over the Nile at that latitude, oriented with precision to capture that exact interaction. The singing was not incidental, it was the function. Someone built a 720-ton stone instrument tuned to the frequency of the rising sun, placed it precisely where it would perform every morning without intervention, and embedded the mechanism so deeply in stone that not even a Roman emperor's stonemasons could silence it without destroying it entirely. No fuel, no maintenance, 3,000 years of daily performance. And then silence, not because the technology failed, but because someone finally repaired it. 10 devices, 10 different cultures, 10 different centuries, and a single thread running through all of them, the persistent, documented archaeological reality that the people who came before us were not primitive. They were not stumbling toward the Industrial Revolution like children learning to walk. They were operating at a level of technological sophistication that the official timeline of human history simply cannot accommodate without falling apart at its seams, because the story handed to you has real holes in it. Holes shaped exactly like these 10 devices. Machines that ran without fuel, built on principles so far outside the accepted model that the easiest response was to explain them away or never mention them at all. That is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. And patterns this consistent, this global, this thoroughly documented, across stone and bronze and clay, do not emerge from random chance or isolated genius. They emerge from a shared inheritance, a knowledge base that existed before the reset, that surfaces in fragments wherever the suppression was incomplete, wherever the stone was too hard to destroy, or the text too widely copied to burn entirely. The civilization that built resonance towers and atmospheric railways and electrical temples and singing colossi did not collapse because it was weak. Civilizations at that level of technological integration do not collapse from within. They are ended, and what replaces them is always the same: a simplified story, a shorter timeline, a history with the inconvenient chapters carefully removed. You have just spent 30 minutes with 10 of those chapters. The question is what you do with them now. Because the research does not end here, the devices do not stop at 10. The evidence does not fit back into the box it came out of. If any part of this resonated with something you already suspected about the official story, you already know the truth that's sitting underneath it. Subscribe. Leave a comment telling us which device stopped you cold. And stay close, because the next video goes somewhere the history books are very certain you should never look.